welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. Walking through an ancient wildwood in Cornwall, I learned that under each of my footsteps lies 300 miles or so of intricate mycelium network. These vast cellular mycelial networks connect the root systems of plants and trees, create and transfer nutrients through the soil, destroy pathogens that would otherwise harm thriving ecosystems, and play a role in our climate. Functional mushrooms like lion's mane, chaga, turkey tail and cordyceps have become more widely talked about now for their health properties and benefits in the wellness world. Well, today I'm joined by a journalist who worked for years at the independent newspaper and CNN International, eventually running CNN Style, their arts and culture department, before turning his passion for amateur mycology into a new and exciting business. George Webster is the founder of the Functional Mushroom Company, and as well as sharing his own story with us, I hope he's going to take us on a fascinating journey which starts more than 1 billion years ago. George, welcome to the Convex Conversation. I am so looking forward to you bringing the fungi kingdom to life for us, if you would.
Thank you so much for having me, Helen.
You're very welcome. First of all, tell us what an amateur mycologist is.
An amateur mycologist is really anyone who takes a concerted and passionate interest in mycology, which is the study of mushrooms. And so through a rather indirect route, as noted in your introduction, I found myself after a long career at various news organisations, deeply intrigued by the fungi realm. It became a source of great fascination to me that there was this realm that exists underneath our feet and all around us and even in our bodies that plays such a foundational role in our ecosystems, in our health and in the world at large, but yet is often been the source of, at the very least, derision and in some cases outright disdain. Mycophobia is the particularly prominent phenomena in the UK and the West more generally, certainly compared to East Asia, where mushrooms are much more revered and understood for the foundational role that they play in our lives. And so, yes, I consider myself to be an amateur mycologist, but so is anyone who really takes an impassioned view of mushrooms and fungi.
Maybe that makes me an amateur mycologist then.
I think so.
I've been busy reading Merlin Sheldrake just after that walk in the wild wood. What is it that makes you so passionate? I know we're going to hear the journey as to how you got there in the first place shortly, but what was it that triggered that interest in the first place?
I had had a very fun career at CNN International, which was not somewhere that I had originally intended to find myself. I'd imagined working at Dazed or ID magazine, but I was at the right place at the right time. And I think by virtue of having a beard and an earring, when they were looking for someone to run a culture department, they grabbed me and asked if I had any ideas. And it was a wonderful journey. CNN International were in a very interesting position when I'd started working there, insofar as they had an enormous global audience, many of whom were incredibly attractive to luxury advertisers, business travelers and so forth. However, there is a difficulty in monetizing hard news. And so the advertising department at CNN were desperate for there to be a safe space for them to attract the more highbrow advertisers. And so from that, they asked me if I could lead the development of a new arts and culture department at CNN. And this was to be CNN style. And it was a fascinating challenge. For many people, I think that the words CNN and style are somewhat oxymorons in many regards. And so I was given free rein to create a new department. And the main criteria was that we had to make something credible and authentic to CNN. And so where we landed with that was a global look at arts and culture in context. And it was a fantastic, thrilling experience to be able to set up a global department. We had bases in Hong Kong and New York. And for many years, it felt glamorous, jetting around covering events like the Venice Biennale and Art Basel and so forth.
What were the most exciting times when you were working for CNN Style? Because I've always been slightly obsessed with CNN Style. So to actually sit here in front of the person who created it with a blank sheet of paper, It does sound it was a glamorous role. What were the most exciting things that offered for you?
Yeah, it was frankly a phenomenal opportunity, notwithstanding trying to bring the realms of CNN and style together. What we did was travel to these major global events like the Venice Biennale, Art Basel, all the fashion weeks, really with a view to taking a wider look and putting it into the context of politics, the economy, society, to make it relevant for a general CNN audience. We brought in some really great names to come and guest edit alongside us, like Richard Rogers and Chen Man and Christian Louboutin and Claudia Schiffer. And what was thrilling was that we had this global reach. We could one week be telling a story from Hong Kong and another in Switzerland at the various watch fairs there and getting insights into the ways that these major cultural events shape a global discourse. And I think that CNN style was quite distinctive in that vantage point. The brief was global and it spanned so many different connecting industries. Personally, for me, I went every year to the Venice Biennale, and there's something that will always be in my heart. There's something very essentially glamorous and romantic about being by the Rialto and going to these various secret parties in piazzas. It has a kind of filmic quality to it for sure. But after a while, I must say that you do get used to it. And so I think that was the moment when I realized, okay, perhaps it's time to venture onto pastures new. If I'm not feeling nothing but abject joy about sipping an Aperol Spritz on a bridge in Venice, then it's probably time for a new adventure.
Well, lucky George, though, I spent a lot of time at the Cannes Film Festival, at the Oscars and all sorts of incredible things. But I think that's all part of life's rich tapestry. And if you're lucky enough to do that, you can't do that every year, day in, day out. And I think it helps shape you in new projects, just as you've been clearly shaped by all your years in journalism. And you can see that shining through with the new company now. It's incredible what you're doing.
Thank you, Helen. After the initial sugar rush of setting up a department and I'd climbed the rungs and become an executive at CNN, things started to settle into more of a normal 9 to 5. That urgency that I think I need to be really engaged in what I'm doing started to wane because there were no more pressing deadlines. And what I now understand was undiagnosed ADHD at play. I really began to suffer from a wayward feeling at work. On the one hand, I felt attached to this quite prestigious role and left wondering, why am I not feeling stimulated? But it had got to a point where I was frankly struggling to respond to emails. And I think in retrospect, I got into journalism because I require the continual pressure of constant deadlines and that sort of intensity. And so it just so happened that in this period where I was in this interminable phase of cruise control that I was struggling to get myself out of, a friend just suggested trying a microdose of psilocybin. So psilocybin is magic mushroom, more colloquially. And the idea with microdosing is you take an incredibly small dose, so about a 15th of what would typically be recommended for a more full-on psychedelic experience, let's say. And the results were extraordinary.
Were they? What happened?
On a day-to-day level, I first of all noticed that what I now understand as ADHD symptoms were much more manageable. I was able to pay the parking fines that had been building up on my desk and respond to the emails and do a lot of the day-to-day, quote-unquote, boring work that I really found sometimes extremely difficult to do, which was fascinating to me. And at the same time, I also felt this wonderful sense of recognition that I didn't have to worry about things that were outside of my control. And that's an incredibly freeing sensation. It also eventually led me to realize that I was emotionally attached to my role at CNN, but actually not really finding it fulfilling anymore. So it in itself ushered me towards a career change. And at the time, I hadn't necessarily thought about starting a mushroom business, but it suddenly opened my mind to the extraordinary power that mushrooms have. And one thing led to another. And that's what opened the door for this deeper reverence for the fungal realm that I now have and has consumed my life for the last 5 years.
The fungal realm, it feels like it's consuming mine because your Instagram posts are very engaging, and I do feel very connected to the health and wellness world, and I'm fascinated by things like mushrooms, and I've watched your posts and they just draw me in, and I can see where that passion's come from. So in those early days when you'd started taking that little tiny microdose and that had helped you feel perhaps more focused and able to get things done, did you then start reading about the history of mushrooms and just wanting to learn much more about them?
Well, this is it. And I'm sure you know, Helen, as a journalist yourself, is once we get the bit between our teeth, we go down the rabbit hole. And certainly that was the case for me. Incidentally, I was also trying to reduce my caffeine intake, which was substantial. And now I understand that this is quite a typical self-medication. I was having about 6 or 7 coffees before 3 p.m. most days. So I was deep in the forums and found that there were lots of people recommending lion's mane and cordyceps and functional mushrooms as an alternative to coffee and caffeine. Suddenly things were aligning. And so I set about, okay, I want to just get the best quality supplements out there. And then that proved to be quite a challenge. And yeah, as a journalist, you want to get double, triple sourced information. So for me, I went to look at the actual studies behind it to see what actual clinical studies there are behind these functional mushroom species. What were the conditions of those studies and which supplements would match the dose and the requirements so that I could be sure that I was getting what was used in these trials. And that was extremely hard. In the end, I had to source them from a supplier in the Netherlands. And then a little while later, after I'd left CNN, it just dawned on me, and this was during lockdown, where there was a lot more focus on health and I think people taking health into their own hands to some degree. And that's when I started to ferment this idea of setting up the Functional Mushroom Company and then spending days and days at the British Library taking copious notes. And that's where things began.
Gosh, it's amazing. There seems to have been an explosion of mushroom supplements in the last couple of years on the market, and a lot more people talking about functional mushrooms, but their properties go back to ancient cultures. In broad terms, first of all, what can mushrooms do for us health-wise? How do they benefit us?
Yeah, well, as I hope we'll reveal during this conversation, mushrooms are extraordinarily powerful organisms in a multitude of ways. Obviously, my initial experience was a mind-altering one, and there are mushroom species that can also shut down vital organs, the death cap being a prominent example. They have this extraordinary metabolic capability which enables them to change both our surroundings and our bodies. And so there are numerous interesting varieties. We can talk about a few. I think lion's mane certainly is
let's
one.
Start with lion's mane.
Lion's mane is the one I think, for understandable reasons, is capturing a lot of attention at the moment. It is quite a beautiful coral-like shaggy mushroom endemic to various places, parts of Asia, North America, and even parts of Europe. And its main headline benefit is its capacity to stimulate the production of nerve growth factor, also known as NGF. And NGF is probably best thought of as like a fertilizer for the brain. So lion's mane contains 2 particularly notable compounds, which are diterpenes. So they're kind of aromatic molecules that are made of blocks of carbon that are similar in some ways to essential oils that you find in plants. And there's 2 in particular for lion's mane. One is hericenones, which are found in the fruiting body of lion's mane, and erinacines, which are in the mycelium. And what is particularly striking about these compounds is that they're small enough to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier and stimulate nerve growth factor. And that is incredibly rare in nature for anything to be able to do that. And the problem for humans is that we can't supplement with nerve growth factor because it itself is too big to pass the blood-brain barrier. And so what you have are these compounds, which once they reach receptors in the brain, they're telling the nerve cells to produce more NGF. And what that results in is you have the neuronal nerves branching out and leading to more connections with one another. So if you think of the nerves in your brain as like a forest and they have these branches, the more branches you have, the more connections you're able to make. And this is what's critically associated with memory formation and responses to stimuli and retention of memories. And this is borne out in a number of high-quality human clinical trials. So in Japan, there have been numerous studies with people a little bit older in age, so especially applicable to the 50-plus age brackets, where we start to see age-related cognitive decline. And there were really striking findings in a study involving 50 participants. They found that after 8 weeks of supplementation with lion's mane, most of these traits associated with neurological decline in age were undone. Very, very striking findings, which has subsequently been replicated. And this is also borne out in animal and in vitro studies where you can actually see these molecules actively stimulating nerve growth factor. And this is what's led to so much excitement, I think, around lion's mane, because of course we're all now absolutely obsessed with optimizing our brains and avoiding what feels like an inevitable downhill journey after your 30s. And so lion's mane, I think, is an incredibly promising functional mushroom with very solid research supporting its efficacy.
Weren't the monks a big fan of lion's mane? It's new to us, but in times gone by, the properties were discovered, weren't they, by people like monks?
Absolutely. So the traditional Chinese medicine texts going back hundreds and hundreds of years document lion's mane's use by Buddhist monks. They would take it regularly in a tea, explicitly for the purpose of enhancing their concentration during intense periods of meditation. And so these studies are simply verifying what many traditional medicine cultures have known for centuries and have been incorporating into their daily life for a very long time. Another great study among menopausal women also found that lion's mane reduced anxiety and was a mood modulator. And this again is thought to be linked to its ability to reduce inflammation in the brain and help repair nerve cells in the brain. And I think there's a growing body of research looking at the relationship between mood disorders and brain dysregulation. And so it's another interesting frontier for lion's mane.
Cordyceps is another interesting one that you talk about in the same breath sometimes as lion's mane, because I think one of your supplements has both of them in. Tell us a bit about cordyceps. And I'm just looking down at my notes, George, and I've written goats.
Yes, so cordyceps are this fascinating species that are native to the high altitudes of Tibet. And they are a parasite that actually co-ops the larvae of ghost moths. So it's a bit of a nasty business. They take over these poor little moths' larvae and sprout the fruiting body, which appears springing up from the ground as these upright, spindly, orange-yellow fruiting bodies. And fruiting bodies, by the way, is the part of the mushroom that we see above ground. And so this story goes that their medicinal and energizing properties were first observed by these high-altitude Tibetan goat herders who noticed that their goats, after consuming these cordyceps, had a lot more energy and were jumping around like mad. And so then they became this very prized species. And now to this day, in fact, Cordyceps sinensis, which is the wild version of Cordyceps, can't actually be commercially cultivated very easily, sells for pound more than the price of gold. It's highly coveted, particularly in China. And modern research is now bearing out what these goat herders had observed many years ago.
Another one I think lots of us have heard of is reishi, and I think a lot of people think about their sleep or calming the nervous system with reishi.
Yes, so Reishi really is the godfather of medicinal mushrooms. It's been revered across East Asia for thousands of years. It has one of the earliest references in the TCM textbooks, and it's been known as the mushroom of immortality. In fact, Chinese royalty for a long time restricted its use just to the higher classes because it was such a treasured medicinal mushroom. And what we now understand about reishi is that it is absolutely packed full of triterpenes and specifically ganideric acids. And these are extremely potent adaptogens. These modulate your nervous system, particularly what's known as the HPA axis, which is responsible for producing things like cortisol. And it's best thought of as like a tuning fork for your nervous system and your body's innate responses to stress. And so especially, I think, for people in today's world where we're probably on average producing a lot more cortisol perhaps than we did in previous times, taking reishi, it coaches your stress response, if it's too high, to come back down to what's often referred to as homeostasis. So it's bringing that balance back. And for those who require a more proactive immune response, it also then lifts it up. So it's a remarkable species. There's less clinical studies behind it, but on a pharmacological level, we can see that it has this wide array of triterpenes and polyphenols and beta-glucans and all of these terms, which I won't bombard you with too much now, but they play key roles in modulating your body's response and essentially training it to adapt better to the environment that it finds itself in.
So you start on this incredible journey, George, and I'm a journalist in the same way as you are. Once I get down that rabbit hole, just more rabbit holes keep opening, and I want to know the nth degree. How was the Functional Mushroom Company born? And how did you learn, through presumably the scientists and the mycologists that you're working with, what is the optimum doses for this? Because these sound like they've got some amazing properties, but explain to me how one works out what the body needs.
It's a really good and important question. So we worked with a number of consultant mycologists to really help us get our head around things. It was really important for me starting out on this that if we were going to do it, we needed to do it properly. I personally, prior to embarking on this journey, had always been a little bit skeptical, frankly, of supplements. And to be candid, that has only borne out even more now that I have a lot of industry insider experience. So to answer the first part of your question, how do we know how, for instance, the mushrooms need to be cultivated and processed and delivered? So it's in some ways not rocket science. You need to ultimately be in line with how the studies were conducted. So for many of these, they were using 2 to 3 grams of mushroom powder. So mushrooms that had been ground down and taken in powder form, quite large quantities, actually. And if you think about it, if you're having a healthy portion of mushrooms on your plate, that's a sizable dose. And so the question for me was, well, how do we get the benefit in a small capsule in a way that's convenient? And so this is where the art and science of extraction comes into play. So one of the distinctive qualities of mushrooms is that they have a substance known as chitin, which surrounds their cell walls. And chitin is the same substance that you find in crab shells. It's an incredibly hard compound. And the problem with that is that it means that mushrooms, if they're not processed in one way or another, incredibly hard for your body to break down. And they can act as basically glorified fiber because it will just go in and you won't have access to these core compounds. And this is what's known as bioavailability. So your own body's ability to actually access the headline grabbing compounds of interest. And so with most mushrooms, you need to go through a process of first a hot water extraction where you pass the dried mushrooms through hot water and then again through alcohol. So this is for the water and non-water soluble compounds. And then you remove all of the fiber away and you're left with this highly concentrated, highly bioactive remaining material. Now, that's the basic Science 101 of how to prepare a quality extract. But beyond that, you still need to know that it contains the things that you're after. So we were talking about lion's mane and irenaceines, and with reishi, you want to know that there are the ganaderic acids in there. And now we have the testing capabilities to actually measure and quantify the presence of these compounds. So this was always going to be a key part of what's important for us. And that was the way that we realized that, okay, this is the opportunity to provide something which is verifiably of good quality and will do what it says on the tin, essentially.
And was some of the reason for setting up the Functional Mushroom Company because of the frustration that you found when you started looking for the quality of supplement that you wanted?
It was, yeah. Something that has really surprised me, having moved into this line of business, is that there really are no checks or quality assurance processes in place. Without wishing to frighten your listeners, the fact is that if we had wanted to, we could have put flour in these capsules. There's no one really invigilating what's going on. Now, of course, there are standards like the Soil Association. We're Soil Association certified, which ensure that you are at least adhering to minimal organic practices and are a good indication that what's on the packet is what it says it is. But unfortunately, there was a study a couple of years ago, as it so happens, looking at reishi, that found that just under 80% of reishi supplements didn't contain anything that was genetically identifiable as reishi, which is obviously rather disconcerting. And so we also go through a process of nuclear magnetic resonance scanning, which basically creates a molecular fingerprint of our finished product and confirms the species identity and that it is what it says it is. Finally, another important consideration when it comes to mushrooms, although they have these cell walls that have this very thick, solid membrane, their actual surface is very porous. And so they are incredibly vulnerable to absorbing all of the pollutants and toxins that might happen to be in the area, or pesticides. So you also want to test for any adulterants as well. And so it's not like making a vitamin C supplement that you can synthesize in a lab and standardize. Mushrooms have a sort of personality. They're quite temperamental. Even relatively seasoned growers can sometimes be surprised that one crop is significantly more plentiful than another. And it almost seems like they have a mind of their own. And if they're not feeling like popping out and fruiting, they won't. And so this also raises interesting questions around where you source mushrooms from. There's understandably, I think, a desire from consumers. They would like to source from England. And I think that that is a perfectly legitimate expectation. The problem is that firstly, we don't have quite the same expertise in cultivating mushrooms, particularly the medicinal mushrooms that we're talking about today in this country. And the result is we've tested mushrooms from the UK and from other parts of Europe, and they don't have measurable amounts of the compounds that we're looking for. And in China, there's a concept called Dao Di, which is this idea that plants and fungi should be cultivated in as close to the environments that they're naturally found. And so we work with a lot of small-scale producers across China and other areas as well, but principally in China because they have families that have been cultivating mushrooms for this purpose for generations, and they have an understanding and an intuition, it seems, that means that they can grow them in a way in close to their natural habitat that means that they're packed full of the bioactive compounds that we're looking for. Whereas in England, until such time as the climate is radically altered, which unfortunately may be the case at some stage, but for now, we don't have natural habitat for many of these mushroom species like reishi to cultivate them in the wild. And so we use essentially industrial cultivation, polytunnels.
It seems to make perfect sense to me that you would cultivate them with people who have wisdom going back hundreds of years, and mushrooms have been here more than 1 billion years. So you could imagine them much happier in their own kind of environment. But it begs the question, what's it like for you when you go to China? I'm almost imagining you back now at CNN style with your glamorous locations, but it must be wonderful to see these species growing because some of them are so beautiful.
They are. They're like sculptures, some of them. You take a polypore like reishi, it has this extraordinary, shiny, reddish brown conch, and to touch it is not really like anything else you would expect. It's a kind of leathery texture. Lion's mane can kind of feel like suede. They're awe-inspiring to behold up close. And I think that the more you dive into the ways that mushrooms have fundamentally shaped our ecosystem, you will move from perhaps disinterested or possibly even somewhat scared of mushrooms, as many people are still, to a profound reverence. And I wish that other people would join us in this appreciation for what mushrooms have really done to shape our world.
I know we could do a whole documentary series on, and they've been done as well, of how mushrooms have shaped our world. But can you give us a sense of how they truly have and do continue to shape our world? Because until I went for that very inspiring walk in the ancient wood, I didn't really know much about them at all. And now I'm absolutely fascinated.
Sure. So our current understanding is that mushrooms evolved about 1 billion years ago. So they predate plants, and lichen, which is a collaboration between fungi and algae or bacteria, were the first to colonize the barren rocks that would have dominated Earth's landscape very early on. And because of this incredible metabolic ability to break down all sorts of substances, they were fundamentally responsible for creating the first soils on Earth. So turning rock very, very slowly into soils. And likewise, the first plants, they didn't have any root structures. So if you picture little low-growing moss appearing on the sides of puddles in these early barren landscapes that would have characterized the world in our very, very ancient evolution, the fungi enabled plants to absorb nutrients from their surroundings. And so they were really the proto-roots for plants. And then eventually plants did grow roots over millions and millions of years, or develop roots. But that relationship didn't end there. 90% of plant species today have what's known as a mycorrhizal relationship, or have a relationship with mycorrhizal fungi, rather. Mycorrhizal fungi are species that have a symbiotic relationship with plants and form around the roots. And the plants provide mycorrhizal fungi with sugars and other molecules, and the mycorrhizal fungi provide the plant roots with additional access to water and to nutrients like nitrate and phosphorus. And so there's this profound, intimate relationship going on that is absolutely essential between plants and fungi in the form of mycelium, which are the roots that are all around us underground. They help to sequester about 13 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So it's about a third of all fossil fuel emissions. But then probably their most prominent function in our world has been as decomposers. They are the grand recyclers of our planet. You have saprotrophic fungi like oyster mushrooms, and reishi is another, that have this extraordinary capability to break down lignin, which is the really solid part of trees, the woody part. And without that, we would be living in a world as we did about 300 million years ago, before these species of fungi had really penetrated the globe. We were living in a time where dead matter was just piling up layer upon layer. And it's only because we benefit from this extraordinary fungal metabolic capability to break down all types of materials that we can now enjoy the planet without being obstructed by a kind of endless piling up of dead matter.
And yet most people, they're not really aware that's going on, or a lot of people aren't aware. And it's also a communication system underground too, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. So Merlin Sheldrake, who's done so much and is a really inspirational character, he's done a lot to popularize the role that fungi plays. And I think he coined the term the wood wide web. And so for those who aren't familiar with it, in addition to helping plants to absorb nutrients more effectively and be more resilient and productive, when we're talking about crop yields, mycelium can actually connect trees between one another. And this enables the trees to send water. Let's say if one tree is in need, it sends signals along these myceliums and enables them to communicate with one another. And likewise, if there is a pest on the horizon, a tree can signal to its fellow trees nearby, time to start producing some defenses against that. It's a really quite beautiful system that has, of course, evolved over billions of years and is really a reflection of just how finely balanced and interconnected our ecosystems are. And it does raise quite pressing concerns. We are now aware that only about 9.5% of the biodiverse fungi hotspots, so these areas that are quite crucial for maintaining ecosystems, are in protected areas. Luckily, it seems like there's more of a conversation now about thinking about the role that mushrooms and fungi play in our environment and the need to protect them.
And they're hugely resilient. When you look, without going off on a real tangent, into what's going on in the world right now, if we came up against a time where we were no longer here, the mushroom and mycelium network and the fungi would be here long after us, wouldn't they?
Oh, without question. Mushroom spores have been found surviving in outer space, right? So there's no doubt at all that when and if we are no longer on this planet, there will be a multitude of mushroom species thriving. We've seen them thrive in extremely inhospitable areas, super high temperatures, really high areas of radiation. And indeed, one of the most interesting areas of applied mycology is looking at the role that they could play in absorbing and cleaning up things like oil spills and microplastics and so forth, because of this ability to digest these compounds and neutralize them. That's, I would say, one of the most exciting frontiers.
What excites you most? What have you learned, apart from the health and the wellness and medicinal benefits? What mushroom story do you like telling most, George?
I love the fact that they can thrive in outer space, I have to say. And there's totally unproven theories that fungi are, in fact, alien forms that colonized Earth via this capacity to spread in space. And that's something that brings a smile to my face. I think that I have found mushrooms have had an outsized influence, not just on my own health, but really how I think about the world and how we can learn really from mushrooms. Mushrooms, as you've noted, are the epitome of resilience. They are also recyclers. They embody the notion of the circular economy. They show us the best systems are ones that are deeply interconnected and not individualistic. They also show us that intelligence doesn't have to be this top-down idea, but you can have highly decentralized intelligent networks that are effective from the bottom up. And I think that they offer a way of decentering ourselves from how we think about the world and invite us to consider a much more egalitarian and distributed mode of living where we're much more in balance and in service to our surroundings.
Spoilers with a couple of more mushrooms. I never know whether I say this properly. Chaga? Tell me a bit about chaga.
Chaga is an intriguing species. It's not actually a mushroom in the conventional sense of the term. It is a sterile conch. It's a mass of mycelium that has congregated and burst out of the branches of birch trees, predominantly in Siberia and Scandinavia. And it's been widely used in traditional cultures for its healing properties. And what we know about it is that it is absolutely chock-a-block full of antioxidants. Antioxidants, for those that don't know, are compounds that neutralize free radicals, and free radicals are molecules that have a missing electron, and they can come from things like pollution, and they can emerge in the body as a result of stress. And over significant periods of exposure to free radicals, we experience very negative health consequences. And the beautiful thing about antioxidants is that they give up one of their oxygen molecules to neutralize the free radical and bring us back into a non-oxidized state. Lots of people associate antioxidants with things like blueberries, which are delicious and great to consume in vast quantities, as my daughter loves to do. But chaga contains about 30 times the concentration of antioxidants, and as far as we're aware, has the highest proportion of antioxidants known to man, more than turmeric and all of these other superfoods. It's really very interesting on that front.
The other name that always catches my attention is turkey tail.
Yes, turkey tail is a wonderfully characterful species that you can easily spot in your woodland walks in the UK. It has this characteristic fan-like shape and an alluring purpley, bluey, yellowy colour, obviously redolent of a turkey's tail. And it's actually flown a little bit under the radar. It's a shame, given that it thrives in the UK, that we don't talk more about it. But in Japan, it's actively prescribed on the healthcare system. It's used as an adjunct in cancer therapies. And it is arguably the most studied medicinal mushroom in existence. There's been over 18,000 participants in various clinical trials. And it is a powerhouse of immunomodulation. So it's using these compounds at PSP and PSK, which are types of polysaccharide, to stimulate the immune system, and really shows extraordinary capability to boost well-being on that front.
Gosh, so when you started the functional mushroom company, what was your vision for it, George, and how is it going?
I think that the vision for us was first and foremost that we would only produce the highest quality that we could find in line with the research, and to be the gold standard really in functional mushroom products, and to be transparent about the compounds of interest, and to test and to really show what's there, particularly in response to just how unregulated the supplement industry is at large. I also want to be able to educate people, and that's why I'm really enjoying this conversation, to be able to share just how compelling the evidence is and the historical use of mushrooms. So to be able to educate our customers and wider audience. In addition to which, I have to say, my background was in CNN style, and I've also enjoyed the more refined things in life too. And another bugbear of mine is that when I was buying supplements prior to this, there was always in these horrible plasticky pots, and I just wanted to hide them away in a dark drawer somewhere. And so we wanted to make packaging that inspired and delighted and encourages regular use, because all the research does indicate that to get the benefit from most of these species does require consistency and regularity over a fairly sustained period of time. And so I dreamed up what would be my ideal bottle for them to appear in, which is also amber, so protects the compounds inside from sunlight degradation. They come in boxes that are made from mycelium itself. So we work with a great company called the Magical Mushroom Company, who produce our boxes that house the bottles, and they're grown to order. So you can see the light little filaments, and it creates a sort of suede-like texture on these boxes, and they can just be broken up and put into compost and will just naturally degrade and feed and nurture your compost heap. And so I think wanting to bring maybe a little bit of romance and glamour into the world of mushrooms, I think was a part that felt missing. There was quite a shroomy aesthetic that was quite prevalent when we started, and keen to present them in a flattering and appealing light that encourages everyone to make them an intimate part of their daily ritual.
Your style definitely shines through. You described some of them earlier as almost like a sculpture. I'm thinking particularly lion's mane is so beautiful to look at. And you can really see that with your posts. You really celebrate the beauty of the mushrooms. And it's lovely to hear that you're using mycelium in your packaging. Hopefully, this wonderful world of the fungal kingdom will carry on giving into the future with things like packaging. And you touched very briefly on, I think, an estimated 13 billion tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere is absorbed into the soil every year, which is equivalent to roughly 1/3 of global emissions from fossil fuels. So they not only played a part in our past and our creation and our current life, but there's real hope for the future, isn't there, in terms of climate change and the environment, to be embracing what they offer away from just the health benefits?
Absolutely. I think that we're only scratching the surface of the potential applications of mushrooms and fungi generally. There's radical ideas involved in even using biological computation to create computers that are actually powered by fungi. And people may have seen clips of fungi connected to electrical wires and able to play their own distinct kind of song via electrical pulses that are naturally produced. And we're seeing now things like leather alternatives. There's a company that uses reishi to create extraordinary pieces of furniture and so forth. And even looking at a future where we're not reliant so much on meat products, we can see the possibilities of using fungi to craft and engineer protein alternatives and so forth. So they seem to lend themselves extraordinarily well to sustainable alternatives to many of the extractive and damaging industries today. And of course, I mentioned previously their use in mycoremediation, and that's an area which I think we'll see huge advances in over the coming years.
Well, you seem to be thriving on presumably taking your own supplements, George. You can see your passion, and I knew that you would bring this whole world to life. I could just carry on talking about this all day, and no doubt we'll probably have a cup of tea and continue the conversation. But thank you so much for giving our listeners a real introduction to what's going on in your world. And congratulations on creating such an amazing brand, which leaves me actually with one final question. What were the challenges, George, of going from this global international brand like CNN to becoming an entrepreneur and starting your own business? You've got such high standards. What has that journey been like for you?
Yes, it has been a challenge. From when I was a young child at school, I would stop off at the bakery and pick up bags of donuts and sell them in the school playground. And so there's been this entrepreneurial spirit that was there. And I guess to some degree, I was able to channel that a little bit at CNN because we were given quite a lot of free rein to almost create this startup within a much larger organization. But in all candor, it's one thing to create a business within a massive support structure, which has international reach and very deep pockets, to going out on your own and setting up a business. I am something of a perfectionist and now also associate that with my ADHD. And it was a challenge to track down and source these species. And during that time where we were doing all this research, there were tons of brands that were launching and it was hard. There were sleepless nights. Every day it seemed there was a new brand coming out. And there was a moment where I felt like maybe we've missed our opportunity here. But I think that people do resonate with products that have care and thought put into them. We launched at the start of 2024 and you release a product and you think, okay, now what? And you realize, okay, now I've got to make a song and dance about this. And that's a whole process of trial and error. And particularly in the era now where so many marketing channels are saturated and you're competing against really big spenders. So you really need to find ways to communicate what's distinctive about what you're pushing. And I suppose that's where my experience as a journalist did help. There is an art to framing things in ways that make people feel that it's relevant to them. And it's about headline writing, as I'm sure you're really experienced with, and creating an eye-catching narrative. And with our latest communications, I think we've cracked that. And this year has been a stellar one for us. And we're now really gaining traction and also a really loyal customer base, which is incredibly rewarding. And it's amazing to have people writing in to say what a difference it's made to their lives and how effective they found it. And that's something that keeps me going through the long solopreneur days and nights.
Oh, and now without sleep sometimes because you have a new little baby to look after too.
Exactly, yeah. I don't know how people do it.
Well, I wish you luck. It's been absolutely brilliant, George. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to George Webster, amateur mycologist. He describes himself as, and I know what he means by that, with that amateur, but you've got a lot more knowledge than most people I know on mushrooms, George, and founder of the Functional Mushroom Company. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with another great guest. Join me then.